everybody, and thank you for joining me today. You can, if there's an issue, you can put it in the chat if you can't see my screen or can't see me or hear me. But my name is Dr. Kimberly Applewhite. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist at Utah Center for Evidence-Based Treatment, and I am grateful to be able to talk to y'all today. Hold on. Our tech is telling me I gotta minimize my controls so that you can see. So this is my presentation. I don't have any conflicts to disclose. I didn't get any commercial support for this presentation. And this basically says, study up. Don't just take my word for it today. Encourage you to do your own work after this. Hopefully this will be a research-filled time or resource-rich filled time for you all. But go and study and get the proper training for any of the things that I am mentioning today. So this is just an overview of what we'll go over. I want to talk about why context matters. The presentation is about culturally specific contextualism, and so just want to give you a sense of what that means to me. I want to talk about rethinking clinical paradigms and effectiveness for BIPOC populations. Also want to talk about incorporating context into different areas of treatment and the elephant in the room. So I am a DBT provider mostly at UCEBT. And so we like talking about the elephant in the room, but I'm not going to tell you what it is, just in case we don't get time to talk about it. But if we do get time to talk about it, then I'll just leave you in suspense for the elephant in the room. Okay, but first I want to take you through a mindfulness activity. So if you've been in a presentation with me before, or I don't know me, you might know that I tend to take an expansive view of mindfulness or a view that is consistent. In the DBT tradition, the Linehan material, it says that anything can be mindfulness. It just depends on how your intention is set. And so I like to incorporate things that I feel will provide a cultural experience, that one that resonates with me, at least, and from my cultural frames. So I showed this video to one of my consultation teams this week. And so if anybody is here from that group, you can just enjoy it again. And maybe cautiously we will do an experiment. So we have never tested out what it's like to have 63 people off mute. And so maybe we will not try that today. But we can try. There is an invitation to participate in the mindfulness by sharing authentic reaction, however you feel comfortable doing that. And so if you want to briefly unmute to provide exclamations, you can do that. If you want to use the reaction emojis to wave your hand, if you want to use the Zoom chat to pump up or share brief thoughts while you're going through, feel free to do that. But commit yourself to participating fully. For this video that I'm going to show you, I was privileged to be able to go to APA convention this year, and Dr. Tama Bryant did a wonderful job of incorporating different cultural traditions into the opening. And so this was a spoken word piece that was shared in that context by Dr. Jaya John, who is a psychologist at Howard University. So I'm going to play this, and remember, you can participate how you will. And if you want the text of this later, I do have it, and maybe it can be shared out with the slides. Okay, here we go. Okay, I would love to get some reactions to this. I'm trying to pull up my YouTube. So Slido is open, or you can put in the chat just what some of your observations or reflections were while you were participating in that. Just what kind of things did you observe going on? If there's a Slido issue, just let me know. This is an open text response, and so you can type as much or as little as you want to in here. Energize, yeah, that's how I felt. History of psych. Looking. If you put something in the chat, it will have to be, I'll have to review it later because I don't want to block the screen. But I appreciate your contribution. I'm having like positive judgments about the rates of responses here, so I appreciate y'all's interaction in this way. Hell yes, I love this. Spiritual activism. I liked the extension of the metaphor of feeding and what that means. Why don't we poetic speaking? I was also glad to see it. Yeah. I love the energy and recognition of Black culture too. We'll get into this when we talk about relationships, but one of the things that I was talking to with Kavika Allen, who works at BYU, and his family is Polynesian. I was saying, like, gosh, with that opening ceremony, I guess I get what it's supposed to be about now. It's supposed to be welcoming. They had, yeah, it was kind of off the chain in that way. They had a African dance troupe dancing to Lift in every voice and sing. But yeah, it's interesting that after several years of a professional identity as a psychologist, sometimes I don't feel welcome in spaces. Yeah, it was powerful. Power of collective in the chat, spirituality, warmth. Somebody said it in the Slido in here. Anyway, I could do this all day, but flights and all. I really appreciate your participation here. Okay, so I want to talk about why context matters. I was telling our marketing person, this is my normal shock and awe aspect of the presentation. I have gone light on the shock, or at least I tried to, but I want to say why context and contextualism matters to me. So if you Google contextualism when you signed up for this talk, you were not alone. I was trying to figure out what word would best capture the just the spirit of what I was going for with this presentation. So contextualism is a term that's given to all kinds of fields that value the role of context when we're trying to make meaning out of things. And in the epistemological approach, which is basically about how we know things or how we know truth, the tenet is that we can only know something if we understand its context. The Association for Contextual Behavior Science describes contextual psychology as the study of human and non-human organisms and their historical and current context. I love we can even be, studying the animals, and that history is important and context is important. And then functional contextualism, borrowed from the parlance, is a paradigm that posits that all behavior either in the traditional sense or the radical sense. See, I didn't even know that uh, a conceptualization of all thoughts or feelings as behavior was radical, but that's what you call it. Anyway, that all behavior, whether it's observed or not observed, or part of your external experience, your internal experience, is functional. And so this is a departure from what you call mechanistic models. And Russ Harris, in his book Act Made Simple, describes this really well. Paradigms like CBT are really most of how a lot of us were trained to do therapy. Um, we're trained to think of like symptomology, like parts in a machine. And when you have something that is not working, that it's a fault in the machine. And so the the goal would be to get rid of that thing, or like, make things work better, to get it to run like you want it to. The example that Dr. Harris uses about the importance of function is, if you saw this three-legged chair, like I have at the bottom of the screen, you might be inclined to think that it's a broken chair, that it's a faulty chair, but really that depends on context, because the chair could be art, the chair could be demonstrating the impeccable balance of a chair from a certain century. This could be a chair that someone used to develop strength in their right leg by balancing their leg against the weight of the other legs. And so we really don't know if something is quote unquote broken or not working, unless we know how it is working. And so I like to think about this, our context, when we're talking about how we provide care that reaches people in different populations. So while I was preparing for this presentation, I just randomly came across this article about the Smithsonian's racial brain collection. I got 40,000 emails in my inbox, and I usually don't read the ones from the Post because it still has a paywall, but they have removed their paywall. So you guys go check it out. If you get the slides, you can click on the link is right under the picture, so you can read it yourself or you can Google it. But basically, for a good chunk of time, the Smithsonian Institute had a collection of body parts. And then in the turn of the century, they started collecting brains of deceased individuals. And it was helmed by a man named Dr. Hrdlicka. And he was an expert on race. There were even articles in like pretty reputable newspapers at the time, but he was a known promoter of eugenics. Like, he was in the societies. He was documented saying that white people were more superior. And so when he helmed this racial brain project, he would collect brains for the sole purpose of proving his claims that white people were more superior. And most of the brains that were collected were from BIPOC people. And he had all these rules about like the purity of the brain. Like, you couldn't be mixed unless it was like calculated. So on its face, it seems scientific, it's just like data collecting. But a lot of these remains were taken without their family's knowledge. He made relationships with hospitals to basically like pre-tomb raid when people were not claimed by their families within a certain period of time, when people were taken off the street and didn't have an ID and died in the hospital. Then these were the kind of brains that he was collecting. And they are still at the Smithsonian, a good number of them. The government, United States government, passed a law, I think in the 80s, saying that any of the brains that came from Native Americans needed to be returned. And so they've been working on that since the early 90s. But there were no official laws or efforts to return or repatriate the remains of these people to their families until very recently. And they even, they collected brains from places like the World's Fair. So they had a collection of, or they like on display a group of Filipinos. And if people didn't make the journey, then this Dr. Hurlica would go and take their brains, all to say that white people were superior. And this seems wild. I mean, it seems wild to me. I don't know if it seems wild to you, but it's wild to me. But then when you think about how this was science back then, and this is the legacy that many of us as mental health providers uh, are subject to, or that is our like field history, this science. And then it also makes me wonder, what are we going to be saying, 50, 60, 70 years from now about the science and the research that we're doing at this point, that will say, our progenitors will say, oh, that was crazy. And so it's important to remember this context of where we came from. So APA in 2021 issued a apology to people of color. And this was a part of post George Floyd efforts to there's a task force, and I'll give the name on the slide, but they issued this apology. And some of the highlights were essentially the admission that psychology both commits and omits things that have contributed to the exploitation of communities of color. And even the ways that we go into communities and publish research, without, we have informed consent, of course, but sometimes we don't have a good sense of what communities want, or how communities might perceive us as being respectful. Sometimes we're using, like it says, white epistemology, so white forms of knowledge imposed on people with different cultural frames. And we continue to be complicit in that as long as we're not intentionally driving efforts to new research. And so, in previous years, you would have seen a presentation like this that says something like, people of color access therapy at lower rates, or people of color have this worse symptom or that worse outcome than white people. And I'm going to try to stay away from that today, though it is hard, because sometimes you want to describe the impact of history, and you also want to be mindful that part of the legacy of bias in the field is disparities research, that the experiences of people of color can only be valued if you were comparing them to white lives. And so I'm going to try to avoid it. So if you want those statistics, there are plenty of them, but not many in this presentation. So it talks about how APA was started by white men, some of whom contributed to popular eugenics idea. Like, eugenics science was like the dominating like fad of the time. It could be like a modern day ACT. I shouldn't say that about ACT. I love ACT. I hope ACT is not the next. But anyway, it was popular. Measures of intelligence were influenced by the same eugenics movement, which I think many people that do assessments are aware of. Research largely interpreted by Eurocentric standards, lack of faculty and advisors of color to assist in graduate schools. I skipped one, but I will mention, because psychology marginalized psychologists from communities of color, it resulted in the formation of other agencies and societies that would best fit their needs. And Association for Black Psychologists is one that broke off, I think in the 60s, like almost in the 70s. And one of the things that Dr. Bryant has done for psychology is to bring these groups back in and give them guaranteed convention time every year, which I thought was has the makings of an effective intervention. But it was interesting to see people that you normally wouldn't see in like the broader conference spaces, and you wonder like how many questions weren't being asked in their absence, or the knowledge that was being developed. And it's not even that we didn't have access to that, but if the environment wasn't serving it, they didn't have a mandate to be at APA, but that was the loss of the society or the association. Um, Lack of adequate focus on social determinants of health. Racism harms all people. I hope this is something we can agree. And then this year, there was a First Nations apology to Natives. And this was delivered at the Society of Indian Psychologists gathering, which is in Utah every year, to my understanding. You learn new things. And so through these two apologies, the Task Force on Strategies to Eradicate Racism, Discrimination, and Hate, APA is super good at names, drafted numerous action items, including intentional efforts to diversify conferences, one of which I've already mentioned by bringing the societies, the different societies in to present each year. But this is one of the things that I learned at APA this year. And while I was going through my Instagram to look for videos that I wanted to show you guys, I realized that I bookmarked something on this years ago, but just never looked. So don't be me. Let us stay up on our knowledge. But did you know? So I assume that most here have heard of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. We need food, we need safety, we need friends, whatever. Self-actualization and transcendence is in some models of this. But did you know? I went to a presentation and it wasn't even about anything that I felt was specifically about different ethnic cultural frames. But there is a representative from one of the First Nations, and she said, of course, we all know that Maslow's hierarchy of needs is based on the Blackfoot pyramid of needs. And I said, what? We knew this? I don't know if I knew this, but it is true. So Dr. Maslow spent a while on Blackfoot Reservation. And when he learned about their perspective of actualization, he used that to quote unquote inform the development of this hierarchy of needs, even down to the shape. And it is a loss again, because from a First Nations perspective, the triangle is supposed to represent a teepee, and teepees, point to heaven. It is, a reflection of the spiritual access and connection to the divine. And so in some ways that's lost almost completely with the Western perspective. Another difference that I'm sure that people will notice is that Maslow's hierarchy of needs is all about the self. It mentions friends, but in the service of self, needing to understand things, but in the service of self, while maybe the whole of Maslow's hierarchy of needs could fit in the purple part of the Blackfoot pyramid of needs. And from there, it moves into community actualization and cultural perpetuity, which is, again, about that connection with the divine. And so we lose things, and this is our context as a field. I hope people are in the chat being like, what? This is crazy, but I won't read it because it will block the screen. So again, why does context matter? Because each of us have unique cultural frames that inform our experiences and help us make meaning of the world. And some of those frames and experiences contributed to our decision to take on certain roles in the world. I was feeling myself today, so I said, it's like a function to our function. And some of those functions or associations may be rooted in ideas that take away from our values orientation as helpers and healers. I know for me personally, one of the reasons why I wanted to be a psychologist as opposed to other helping professions was the prestige of being a doctor. But, the prestige of being a doctor comes with power and privilege in unique ways. And if I weren't being mindful of those things, then I have the potential to do something that is not befitting of our values. There's some things that, maybe we are served if you have other forms of privilege. You may be served by some of the ways that psychology has been white centric for so long. And I think that this is an important thing to be aware of in terms of function, because then you can decide what it is you want to use, what it is you want to lose, or, keep in your pocket, or just observe and let collect dust, whatever. But it's important to see it. And then our clients who share some context with us, especially context of the therapy room, also come with unique cultural frames. And so, if we're thinking about all of the different things that might influence people with diverse ethnic backgrounds to seek treatment and to stay in treatment, there's so many reasons why this could be. And so, we can't know without knowing the context of where someone is coming from. This is from the APA First Nations apology. And it says, let us commit to listening more and talking less, following more and steering less, advocating more and complying less, including more and ignoring less, and collaborating more and commanding less. So I thought that was a nice thought. Okay, before I move into the next part, I'm just gonna stop share and get out of my email. Thank you for your patience. It's the life of a neurospicy brain. You think that you close out all of the noise-making things, but there's always tabs on tabs. And so I closed Teams, but I cannot figure out where my email is. Oh, I have figured. Thank you for your patience. Okay, I hope I have found it. If I have not, please forgive me. Okay. Alrighty, back to this. Okay, so I want to talk about rethinking clinical paradigms and effectiveness a little bit. And the bottom line is, before I give you the bottom line, I want to remind people of the distinction between evidence-based practice and empirically supported treatment. Evidence-based practice can be anything that works, and you have tested and shown that it has the outcomes that you want to see. Empirically supported treatment is what we're talking about. We're referring to the interventions that have been tested through these large, like RCTs, when we're talking about gold standards and those type of things. And so I remember when I was first coming to work at UCEBT, even with having an orientation to evidence-based practice for a long time, I felt a little bit intimidated about working at a place for evidence-based treatment, because I had the empirically supported treatment piece in my mind. And I'm like, ugh, it's so official. It's so like formulaic. It's like a little stodgy, if I'm going to be real. But I think it is important to make this distinction, because there's all kinds of things that work. And surely we do a lot of empirically supported treatments at UCEBT, but we also do a lot of evidence-based practice. So one of the reasons why I really admire my colleagues, so this is not what this talk is about, this is not a plug, but I admire them because they're really committed to finding what will work on an individual level, even while considering what is supposed to work on a global level according to the empirically supported research. And so it's been a great group of people to join myself to in the time that I've been there. But when it comes to empirically supported treatments, few of the original trials, especially for things like CBT, included large numbers of people of color. So, in essence, what does this mean? Would you say that no empirically supported treatment works for people of color? Would you say that it is unethical to apply empirically supported treatments to people of color because the evidence base is not there? I don't know if that would be the case. We have ethical guidelines in most of our fields that say, in most, if not all, that say, like, if you don't know exactly what will help, you need to go on what your best guidance is, and what empirically supported treatments are our best guidance on what we could do in a situation. Every research study has limitations, but this happens to be a big limitation. Imitation, I almost said that could be true too. But there are cultural adaptations to treatment that have an evidence base. And a lot of those are demonstrated to be more effective, especially when compared to treatment as usual. So this is good, and or at least good information to know. And a lot of the adaptations involve like things like an increase in cultural representation, shifts in the language, incorporating experiences of racism and discrimination. But one limitation of these studies is that they often do not have the large numbers that those empirically supported treatments do. A lot of them are taking place in community settings, where there may be a lot of other factors that come in that make things effective or not. So, what does that mean? How do we interpret this? Do we say, oh, because it came from the community, we got to throw it out? I mean, I work in the community. I assume many of you all work in the community. You work in a community. And so it's not to say that uh, even those things won't be helpful for the people in your community. But I hope that thinking about this will allow people to think about how they can be empowered to use different approaches and strategies that will work. I used to be intimidated in another way when when I was in school, I was into the cultural adaptation kind of track of things. And I wanted to do a cultural adaptation of TFCBT for racial stress. And I remembered feeling overwhelmed because I'm like, well, what if these pieces don't fit? There are kind of some questions you ask that don't make, sometimes it doesn't seem to jive. But when you think about how you can make something work for your community, for your location, for your context, just by piecing together things that have shown to be effective for similar groups, it really allowed me to move forward in what I was trying to do. One of the people that I was inspired by, or always have been inspired by, is Beverly Tatum, who used to be the dean at Spelman College, or she's had different jobs over the course of her career. But she wrote Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria, which maybe many of you have read. That's about racial identity. I was going to show it to you, but I don't think it's close enough. But one of the things that she talks about in her book is creating a program for Black people in a predominantly white university. So she definitely wasn't at Spelman then. And it was centered around affirming identity, building community, and cultivating leadership, because those three things, especially affirming identity, is associated with positive outcomes in terms of racial socialization. Building community is also related to socialization of race, but also fits in well with, behavioral activation paradigms and cultivating leadership too. And so we're allowed to say what works for a certain group of people and be empowered to do that for our communities. There's a few paradigms that I'll talk about that I tend to incorporate when I conceptualize things when we get into our case material. which is coming. So first way I want to talk about incorporating context is in the field of assessment and consultation. I want to say thank you. I should have put it in the slide, but thank you to some of my colleagues helped by supplying case examples that I could use in my presentation today. And so I'm really appreciative to them. Again, not the presentation to love on my work colleagues, but so easy. Anyways, so this is for you, and this is going to be the first use of our breakout groups for today. So John is a 24-year-old Black heterosexual cisgender male. He presented for therapy after being mandated by his track coach at a small private university in the Pacific Northwest. John had a pre-existing diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder. He came to his current university after having been arrested on the East Coast for indecent exposure. John was referred to the University Counseling Center by his track coach after the coach had received complaints about John's behavior from women on the team. The track coach told John that he had to present for therapy or else he would be kicked off the team. So in your breakout groups, oh my goodness, 5 people have left. They are scared. For breakout groups, if you only had an hour to spend on this assessment, when I was in college counseling, I only had about 50 minutes to an hour. What would you prioritize in assessment? What kind of instruments would you administer? And what would your clinical impressions be? Okay, I think we're most of the way back. All right, we're gonna use Slido. What would you prioritize? Let me make sure I don't have to start it. What would you prioritize in assessment? I should have had you pick one representative for each group, but because I didn't, we're gonna do this like chicken. So you can't put something that somebody else has put. So this is like part mindfulness, part, yeah, no. Yeah. How do they feel about being a mandated therapy? Dang, dang, dang. Insight. Assess insight. Trauma history. I'm curious. Power dynamics in the therapeutic relationship. Oh, somebody came ready. What is the client's view of the autism diagnosis? Is it BS? Were they diagnosed in Utah? Just kidding. There's, high prevalence of autism in Utah, and it's real. What are their anxiety symptoms? Was their understanding of consent? What is their ability to perspective take? So that's like a symptom assessment. Somebody put in the chat what or John's own perception of his needs. What are his experiences of racism? Oh, okay. So stats of the percentage of BIPOC students at his college. Yeah, that's what I want to know. If he wants to be in therapy, was he the only person on the team? Let's do some lawyer work. Okay. Experience of racism on campus and in life. Life is big. Y'all got an hour. I want to know how you do it. Understand his strengths and resilience. I love that because, sometimes when there's a snafu in the mix, it's hard to prioritize what somebody feels like is strong. Y'all are doing well. Okay, so let's see what else you thought. So what instruments would y'all administer during this 1 hour assessment? So I guess in some settings you can give people measures before they come. Our place is one of those, but let's say, well, I didn't say this before, but I was gonna say, let's say you had to do it all in session, which is often how it is in the college setting. You have basic measures that you can send, but not all. So we got a PCL. It's a trauma measure. Probably not many. Got you. Okay. We got some instrument lovers in the mix. So CAQ is for autism traits. Y'all wouldn't give a whole lot. Or wait, Jen is texting me. Quality of life, personality measure, social and communication skills screener, personality, BDI, depression inventory, anxiety measure. When I was in college counseling, we did PHQ-9, GOD-7. Those are popular, just quick and dirty things. For an hour, they are useful. They have their place. Okay. Let's see, one participant, what you were typing before I move to the next. Oh, you stopped typing. Okay. Remove. Oh. RADS, which is related to autism as well. We're going to confirm this autism situation. Okay. I'm into it. Okay. What were some of the team's clinical impressions, or what kind of questions did you have? What did you think was going on? What do you think is afoot if the person who did this client was here? No spoilers. Adapting to a new environment. I'm glad for the anonymous person that wrote that sometimes it's hard. I experience this a lot. When I used to do a lot of teen work, even in that situation, I feel like my client is the teen. And so it's hard when parents refer because I already feel like divided loyalties. And so in a situation where the coach or the teammates are driving a lot of the reason for therapy, it's hard to not have that trickle in and affect like how you see truth claims, or how you know what to take seriously, or how long you evaluate certain things, ruling out against the will of other people. Yeah, the latest anonymous is it. Nick, how did you get your name in? I thought that I said it anonymous. So brave, so brave. But being over sexualized as a Black man is seen as a predator. Yes, 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 yes. Tale as old as time. At APA, I went to Howard Stevenson's talk. He's somebody that I've admired for a long time, and he mentioned that the studies show that fear of Black men is just as ingrained into most American psyches as like fear of snakes, which is shocking. And so there's a lot of things that come in through the air conditioning vent. There's so many things that we could assume about what's going on, but I like that you are saying just because there's two things that seem to be related, it doesn't mean that they are related. And so really taking time to assess, because they could be like unrelated incidents. And I would also wonder about like the degree of like secret keeping, or rumors that have been started. Be sure to close the door, please. Close the door. Anyway, my 4-year-old was here. I don't know if you saw. Yeah, these are good thoughts. Small private college in Pacific Northwest is gonna be white. It is true. Okay, so we're gonna talk about some things too. Assessment strategy. So how I tend, I guess like a basic thing to think about is like, what's your level of investment in culturally adapted instruments? And this is both for whether you're doing this kind of assessment, like an intake, or you're doing larger assessments. There are culturally adapted instruments out there, and you can be trained in them, or make it a part of your practice to network with people who have made that investment. I don't know about you, but like as my career advances, and I'm still technically an early career clinician, I only have so much time in the day, and I have maybe 6 unwatched trainings like in my queue right now. And so logistically it is hard for me to say, even as well intentioned as it might be, that I am going to go like learn a different language so I can learn a new assessment, or I am going to get trained on this very specific thing, though I may really want to. And so we can work together with people in the community and network with folks that we know do that kind of work, develop relationships, so that our clients, when they come to us, know, even if we don't know everything there is to know about everything, that we're willing to go that extra mile and talk to the people who do. It's also important to consider the impact of language in assessment questions. And so you can just do a search for the alternatives. It's interesting to think that most of us probably know that when we're assessing for depression in adolescents, that it's a good idea to also assess for irritability. And we have all these ways that we ask about irritability because we know that not every adolescent expresses depressive mood, like, sad, cry, emo, whatever. Some of them are like more rage against the machine depressed. But maybe some of us don't have that same sense of how people from different cultural frames ask questions differently. And so a lot of times in various communities of color, especially in the Black community, and I would say East Asian communities, the experience of pain is linked to certain, DSM-5 symptomology. And so it's a good idea to ask about, chronic pain, like headaches, uh, wakefulness, or, like quality of sleep, and those kind of things. Because sometimes if you straight up ask somebody if they've been depressed or they've been sad, there might be some reason that they're like, oh, no, no, that does not uh, relate to me. So you can do a literature search for this. And I know not everybody has access to journals, but you can Google some things. There's a lot of open access. If there was one positive thing about the pandemic, I usually call it the ponderosa, but not all of you know me. So there's one positive thing about the pandemic is that there is more open access material than ever before. And so if you need to take time to do some of that research for yourself, then that's great. Oh, thanks, Amanda. Uh, I would put it in. I practice pretty transdiagnostically generally, but yeah, if I have my vote for what goes in the DSM-6, then yeah, Rage Against the Machine. And then you also want to consider the context of the time period that people have lived through. This is another throwback to looking at historical context. For example, the scale that I have written here was developed specifically for Asian Americans that were involved in the Vietnam War as veterans, which is interesting because there's all kinds of ways that you would classify what a veteran was in Vietnam or what the context was. And so there might be certain things that happened in the period of time that is relevant to the client that affects what assessment instruments you use. I mean, I was trained on the WISC-4 in school. And so when the WISC-5 came out, there's already all kinds of changes about the impact of technology. But now you give the WISC-5 and it's a little bit outdated in terms of what people would do or what their normal practices are. And so context of time is important across the board, but especially when we're talking about specific periods of racial stress. I once had a client who was a kid that would sleep with his parents at night, though he was 11, I think. And he would have nightmares that his father was going to get taken away. And it turned out that and forgive me if you have heard this, if I have presented to you before, it turned out that the kid's father was not a citizen of the United States, though this had not been formally disclosed to the child's. And he started to sleep with his parents around the time that Donald Trump was beginning his first presidential campaign in New York, where I was at the time. So the time period is important. I was having a conversation with a colleague who was here, so no shade, but we're talking about how it's hard to stay engaged with the news sometimes, but it is important to recognize the impact of like historical situations and our current lived experience. Remember, you have the power along with the client to determine what is valid or not. recently did an assessment where the results said one thing, but clinical impressions said another. And so if you think that something is going to be weighted a certain way because the instrument is flawed, you're probably right. Nothing was built for us. Shoot. So just remember, you have the power to determine what's valid. And so these are some assessment instruments that I am into. These are different ways to assess racial and ethnic stress. I should have listed Carter first. Robert Carter is one of the researchers that had, seminal work on race and trauma back in 2007, I want to say. And so I kind of like to see him as the godfather in some ways of how we think about race-based traumatic stress, which has gone back and forth in how we conceptualize it. But he has a race-based traumatic scale inventory that you can use to evaluate the impact of certain incidents. The Yukon Racial and Ethnic Stress and Trauma Survey is done by Monica Williams and one of my colleagues, Aisha Metzger, who is now at Georgia State, I want to say, and it has been validated in the Spanish-speaking communities up there, which is great. And so they have that instrument in English and Spanish. There's a whole review of different child and adolescent instruments that you could do. There's not that many. There's probably 12 all told, but 12 is better than 0. But one of the things that I'm really excited about right now is the Wright Constantine Structure Clinical Interview, which came out of NYU Steinhardt, Go Violets. And so it is based on the Hayes addressing model, which, man, even at the places I work has seen like a heyday in conceptualization right now. It's from back in 2008, but it uses the addressing as an acronym that stands for certain things. And so they have the structured clinical interview based on prompts from these areas. So who's in the family? Like, who do you consider your family? How does that affect who you are and how you live? Do you think any major events affected who you've become? And this is just for the age question. And then it goes into gender. So like this person, how was it growing up as a boy in your culture and your family? How has being a man affected your experience in the world? Then you've got ethnic and racial identity. How do you feel about being Black? How has being Black affected you? Do you have experiences with racial or ethnic conflict? And so I really do think that this has a lot of promise. And like Marty said, not necessarily for like getting through in an hour, but increasing in trust and also doing things to aid conceptualization far from the reason for referral, so to speak. I think one of the strengths about the person who sent this case to me is that they tend to be naturally curious about experiences of racism, like you were, Dr. Gutierrez. But then sometimes, like, I remember around the time of George Floyd and whatever, it was hard for me to engage in conversation around those topics, even if I wanted to, because the potential for invalidation just felt so high that I felt like I didn't want to test it with people that I had like any kind of stake in the relationship. So it was an odd time, needing people but not wanting to talk to people, and I guess the dialectic. And so being able to take these not unrelated points, but think about what's meaningful to the client, I think can be a powerful thing. I think that it gets tricky. So that was the next part of the presentation, is talking about like, what's the evidence base in relationship building. And controversially, it's not that people really need to be with somebody that matches their ethnicity, because the research is mixed on the effectiveness of it. Like, it doesn't make much of a difference, but I think most people will kind of do this and create stories for themselves because we think it must be, right? Like it must be that you have to share something with the person, but you already share something. You share a history, especially if you grew up in the same country. You share a community. If you're practicing where you work, there's people that do telehealth and stuff, but you share a country. The country's got all kinds of things going on. Like there's all kinds of context and frames that you do share. And so I think when it comes to people who seek treatment, especially in the BIPOC community, you find that like a lot of the time, what is the barrier to engaging in treatment is more logistical, at least as stated. Of course, we got to question the research on this because maybe they weren't willing to say, I don't trust this white person. But like most of the barriers that are stated are logistical as opposed to being like, I'm not going to trust this person because they share a certain ethnic background. That being said, though, I think a lot of the things that are in the evidence about what contributes to a positive alliance are fostering curiosity and taking time to build the relationship, and engaging in uh, like inviting cultural practices rather than presenting like, hey, I do all of these things. I was reading something recently, or I was watching something actually, by a psychologist, and it brings up how a lot of times people from marginalized communities present for trauma treatment, or people that have like complex trauma, high childhood ACEs, things like that. Those people, it's exposure for them to come to therapy. And sometimes the more that you present yourself as somebody that won't let them down, the more that they think, especially in a trauma context, that you will let them down. And so it's like really being able to take time to build the relationship, because for people, even for John in this case, relationship building will be exposure. And so it would almost be, like the way I conceptualize it, it would almost be like flooding, to be like, oh, but listen, I do all of these things. There might be opportunities for curiosity to say, what is it like? I mean, the coach, we didn't get to this point, but the coach is white. These people that are accusing him are white. And so you might ask, how does it feel to be in the room with another white dude that has all this, seemingly has all this power about what happens? And people can answer questions like that, maybe not the first time that you meet with them, but research indicates when you bring up the conversation that people are grateful for that thing down the road. And so okay, what books, let me fly through this thingy thing, and see what else I got in here. Well, no, I'm not going back to this, but you will get it, so that's good. I have so many resources in this thing. So the next part of the presentation is about cultural adaptations to existing frameworks. And these are like pretty easy to look for, like public access wise, in most of your main communities of color. As I mentioned, I worked with Dr. Metzger, who did a prominent trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy adaptation. So there are protocols that you can follow, but I also think when you're talking about like how you adapt things, you can also think about the approaches that you apply when you're using that framework. It's like the protocol is the keys, but you are the driver, you know what I'm saying? And so I'm guided by family systems approaches. Family systems is like kind of behavioral, but it's more systemic than behavioral, because it talks about, it's functional. Like things have function within a system. And so when things come up, they're not good or bad, but it's just doing something in that cell to make it do something. And so if you want a system to do different things, that creates certain types of strain in the system that lead to different things. is in essence what family systems talks about in terms of relationships, but really you could take that systems approach broadly to be able to greet clients in a way that welcomes them in. I'm also inspired by communitarian approaches that focus on how you build progress by focusing on shared values. And it values a lot of the things that across the board tend to be value systems in communities of color, like collectivism, uh, like working together, not keeping secrets. So this has a lot of implications for supervision and training, as well as how you work with people to think that with a client or working together, building on shared values and goals. I meant to do something on my cultural frame, but I didn't. But I'm Black, surprise, and LDS, maybe legitimately surprised. And so sometimes when I talk about like building on shared values, I'm like, like building on common beliefs. It's just like the 90s in the Mormon church. But anyway, communitarian approaches relate to that. There's also, somebody that registered brought up liberation psychology, which has this focus on freedom and balancing out the weight of oppression, and that was developed in South American communities. And so there's lots of ways that you can prioritize those principles, even look at things in the context of existing protocols and say, like, is this working? Does this work in this situation? Do we need to talk about it a different way? When I was running DBT groups at HMHI, the inpatient hospital back in the day, I used to call for DBT BS calls. So like when I presented something, I'd be like, okay, well, does anybody think that this doesn't work for them? And that is allowed in the model, but you can do it in a more radical sense for people that might have something, something doesn't smell right to you, just bring it up. Another thing that I think is important about cultural adaptation is being sure that you're bringing in relevant material that's relevant to them. So if you're not doing an adaptation of the intervention from a protocol that is culturally adapted, then you want to think about how you are modifying what is used in that protocol to without research, you wouldn't be modifying any of the elements of it, but trying to make it as representative as possible, which is something that BIPOC people tend to benefit from or have positive outcomes from in therapy. I have an example of this on my mini tabs. So this would be, to me, an example of a cultural adaptation for treatment. I get surprised by how many therapists don't like being on social media. I live on social media. I'm like hardcore Facebook generation, millennial, whatever. Don't at me. But I'm learning TikTok, and it makes me feel like I don't know what to do with it. And there's like algorithms and whatever. So, I have an account, but I don't be getting on there. It scares me. But what it is good for, and we all know at this point that the algorithm will just generate more of what you want to see if you go in and use it and look for certain things. So if you go and look for resources to help your diverse clients, then you'll just get more resources to help your diverse clients. How about that? And then you won't have to ask as many questions. So I want to show you something that I found when I was experimenting with TikTok. You got to see who the content creator is. It swears. I don't swear, but this swears. So, if you're not into that, I apologize. But oh my goodness, I'm not going to tell you how to feel, but don't you love it? I love it because it incorporates. There is nothing about that you could not find in a manual. However, other than, the pacing of the breathing, whatever, we're not going to sweat that. Breathing is breathing. But this is something that you could present to people to make them feel like things are relevant. And then maybe, after, many years of seeing music as my primary form of meditation, I finally got into Snowflakes on a Lake. It's not even that Snowflakes on a Lake doesn't have value, but like if that was my entry point to mindfulness practice, for many years I was not about it. And then in terms of like resources, one thing I'm really excited about is a crew of people got together and did a healing racial stress workbook for Black teens. I'd say that it is pretty, no, they say for teens, all genders. This was released just a couple weeks ago by the one that I know is Farzana Salim, who is at Stanford, but it's a whole list of authors. And so it's a workbook that is CBT based, but talking about healing racial stress, and it incorporates all kinds of psychoeducation on microaggressions and incorporating racial socialization research, affirmations of pride and preparation for bias that are proven to have positive outcomes in the Black community. And there's some other things too, but it'll all be in the slides. I'm just going rogue at this point because clearly I've been so excited. So this is something I bought. You can get journals. This is also a CBT based resource. It's called My Therapy Card. And the journal you can use along with cards that give CBT type prompts on emotion regulation and thought exploration. And so this is by Dr. Ebony. You will get all of this, but the question was asked, and so I'm answering it. Yeah, if you have any questions, my email is in the chat. Clearly, this was a 6-hour conversation, but you will get all slides. You can email me whenever you want. I'm a DBT therapist that is struggling to set boundaries for all kinds of information input. So thank you for joining with me today. I appreciate it. Hopefully we'll see you soon at another event. We got a presentation on PCIT, which I love. It's one of the only evidence-based treatments that has strong empirical support in communities of color, especially Hispanic population, so trauma. So come and see the PCIT presentation by Dr. Gross, September 15th. All right, thank you.